Welcome back, girls. So this video will be looking at measures of economic growth. So far in our course we've looked at different models to show the whole economy, how they're connected and the different relationships between those sectors. So we looked at three different models. We looked at the circular flow model, the production possibility frontier, and then the ASAD model. So now we need to understand how we measure growth. And there's three different ways that we're going to be looking at today. So the first one, as you can see over on the right there, we've got GDP. So GDP stands for gross domestic product. The second measure of economic growth is net social welfare. The third is human development index. So those are all just the shorthand letters that you'll see written around, but they do have expanded names. So we'll be looking at each one in a bit more detail now. So the first measure we're going to look at is GDP. So that stands for gross domestic product. So this measures the value of all products that are manufactured and sold in one country over a year. And we usually look at them compared to a year, but you can also look at GDP over quarters. So if we just break this concept down, and for example, imagine our class is an economy, and we each make different products and services. So we're all different businesses. And then if we look back over the year and look at the value of what we have sold, and we add that all together, we would have our GDP figure. So it's like the output. So let's say in year one, person one sold $2,500 worth of products. So could be anything. Maybe they're making coffees and they added up all the different coffees they've sold. So the value of the output would be $2,500. Let's say person two sold another product and their total output was worth $6,000. Let's say person three, their total output was $5,500. So overall, our total output would be $14,000. So that's for year one. If we looked at year two, person one might have increased their output and made $3,000 worth of products. Person two also increased, went up to $10,000 from $6,000, and person three went down, so they decreased in output to $3,500. So overall, the output is now $16,500. So overall, we can see that the total output has increased. The GDP is actually measured as a percentage. So now we just find the percentage difference, and the formula is year two minus year one divided by year one. So 16,500 minus 14,000 divided by 14,000 gives us 17.85%. So we would say GDP rose 17.85%. Now I've just completely made this up using people in our classes of the economy, and there's only three different outputs there. When we look at New Zealand overall, if you imagine every single business and their output, it gets a lot more complicated than this, but that was just to simplify the concept for you. So if we actually look at New Zealand, there's a website you can see up the top there called Stats NZ. Really, really awesome for all types of different data. But here we can see so this is just a screenshot I found. So GDP, this is looking at 2019, so last year. We can see overall there that it says 2.3% was the annual growth. Okay. And then $310 billion was our total output in 2019. So that's the dollar value. So now, in 2018, they would have measured that against what the output was in 2018, and the percentage change was 2.3%. So the numbers are really small. It's not 17% like I did in my example. It's anywhere between 1 and 5% is usually the range. But then in saying that, the Reserve Bank, they have a target as well. So if the if we just look and think about this in terms of economic growth, obviously if it's a positive number, the economy has grown, the output has increased. If it is a negative number, that's telling us that there's been a decrease in output. So the economy has decreased. So as we can see, gross domestic product provides a snapshot of the performance of the economy. GDP is New Zealand's official measure of economic growth. So this is how we look at our whole country and how it's going and what's happening. And yeah, it's a really, really effective measure. And now that you know about it, you might start hearing it more in the news or around. It's quite popular at the moment with everything going on. So see if you can find some figures or some changes that have happened. Because with the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of businesses have had to stop. Therefore, their output has decreased, right? So if we look forward, we're probably going to decrease if we just think about all the businesses that aren't creating output right now. And then if we link it back to our circular flow model, we can see that, so in the producers section, producers create the output, right? So if they're creating more output, so their goods and services are increasing, that means households are going to work more. We're going to need more people to do more work to create more things. And then if households are getting more money in terms of resource payments, remember is income. So Y stands for income, so resource payments. It's the same cycle, they're going to buy more. So it's this beautiful cycle of moving the money around the economy, and if the producers create more output, households theoretically have more income to spend or save or invest. So that's linking it back to the circular flow model. And there's a good little article down here that you can see the link to. You might need to type it in. But it talks about the government paying households a cash payment. You might have heard about it in the news recently. And if we look on our circular flow model, that would relate to the arrow that's moving from the government to the producer, so letter G, because the government is spending money. Some of that money will go into the producers, so into businesses, but then it can also be that other arrow leaving the government in terms of transfer payments. So depending if you're a household or a business owner, that's where the money flows will be going. And then looking at our circular flow model, we know that the money flow is then going to move around the economy via household spending more, if it's moving from household, consumer spending, or they might save it, or producers might produce more goods and services, or maybe they keep people in their jobs by hiring more people or keeping the same people. So this concept that the government are thinking about doing is for the reason to stimulate economic growth. That's the whole reason. So it's a really, really good example of what we're learning about right now. Okay, so GDP, it can get a little bit confusing, but it's not actually confusing. But we know that GDP is the total market value of all final goods and services produced in New Zealand. And you can do this for any country, in either a year or a quarter. So it's the dollar value. That's what you need to remember. So there's nominal GDP and then real GDP. Real GDP is the value, the same thing, the value of all the goods and services, but it's called constant prices. So that adjusts for inflation changes compared to nominal, which doesn't. So we always use real GDP. So I'm just telling you this so that you understand why it's real GDP. So yeah, real GDP just measures the actual output so that we can compare it a lot easier from one year to the next. Because if we look at inflation, well then we can't we don't have an accurate measure to compare. So in this example that I've put down in this table, just to show you the difference between nominal and real GDP. So we've got surfboards, and then stand-up paddleboards. So let's say one company, they're the two different companies, year 1 to 6, quantity and price, and then same for stand-up paddleboards. So if we were calculating nominal GDP, we would simply times the quantity times the price plus the quantity times the price for each business. So in year 1, we have 1,430,000. So we're just adding up the business's total output. That's all we're doing. And so on and so forth for all of those years. So that would be nominal GDP. If we look at real GDP, which you can see in that second column over, the formula is Q, so quantity. So we're looking at year 1, 250 times, and then PY1 means price in year 1. So 250 times 2,000, so same, plus 620 times 1,500. So it's the same for both nominal and real GDP, as you can see there. They both have the same answer. But when we go to year 2, you'll notice the difference. So nominal GDP, we times quantity times price and plus them together, we get 1,542,000. But for real GDP, what we would do is it would be quantity, so 270 times price in year 1. So instead of using 2,100, which is the price in year 2, we would use the price in year 1. So that's saying that the value is the same, but the output has changed, right? And then plus 650 times 1,500. So the price in year 1 and 2 for stand-up paddleboards has remained the same. And that's how we get 1,515,000. So that's just the difference between nominal and real. So real GDP just simply uses a baseline year. In terms of the test or the exam, I don't think you'd need to be able to work this out how I've showed you an example here. It's just good to know the difference, and knowing those two different definitions will be helpful for you. So if anything, just learn the definitions, know the difference, and just realize that we always use the base year to calculate real GDP. Okay, so this is just a bit of an expanded slide from the previous slide. So we know nominal GDP, it's just showing you how to do it there, and an example for real GDP. And then again, real amounts are only calculated with reference to a base year. So I would like you now to try practice the rest of those gaps in the boxes. So years 4, 5, and 6. And try calculate the percentage growth as well. So remember, it's year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1. That's the formula up in that box. So pros and cons of using GDP of economic growth measures. So it's measurable, as it's based on the transactions within the market, so it's really objective to measure. We've got numbers to compare. It's an internationally accepted measure, so lots of countries use this. And we can also look at real GDP per capita. So this means the output per person. So this also shows us how much output one person is doing, so productivity. The limitations of the real GDP measure is that it doesn't include other parts of output, so growing your own vegetables, DIY repair work, or parents caring for children at home, volunteers, because there's no transaction, so it's not being measured. Real GDP doesn't show us the non-economic impact on the environment and our lifestyle, So it's not a good indicator for our overall well-being of society. So it's just based on numbers and money and output. It doesn't show us whether the growth in output is for goods consumers enjoy or whether it's due to a particular event, such as when the earthquake happened, GDP increased because there's a lot of activity happening. It doesn't distinguish if it's a building at school or a prison or wherever it might be, so it could be government funded. It doesn't show us exactly what's happened. And some regions, we can look at different regions of output as well. So depending on the region, they might have extra growth compared to other regions. Here's an example there you could read. And changes in the quality of goods over time is not reflected in GDP. So for example, computers have increased in quality and reduced in price, but the GDP doesn't show this. So in this, in our learning workbook that we're doing, if you go to page 88, you'll see that it talks about economic growth and specifically gross domestic product. When you've got this page open, it might be a bit easier to see. You'll see that at the bottom there, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So now it all links together where spending, so all the spending in the economy, as we know, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports, we put it all together and all of that spending is part of GDP. So now GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And when we think back to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, real GDP is one of the components along the axes, so along the x-axis. And then we use those factors that shift the demand curve. So hopefully it's all linking together a bit more now. Alright, so let's look at measure number 2, net social welfare. So we saw that GDP is the value of all products that are manufactured and sold in one country. But if we think about all the producers are producing more and the output's gone up and the dollar value's gone up, does that mean we are living better? So the quality of life is important when we think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we looked at. We need a nice environment, we don't need pollution, we need to look at our health and our education systems, and we need to be able to travel without traffic congestion. So once we take all of these things into consideration, we call this measure net social welfare. And this is the measure that includes both economic and non-economic factors. So what if all the money was only with a certain percentage of people and the rest were struggling or perhaps poorer? So that concept is called income distribution, and net social welfare includes this, as well as housing, house crowding, and house crowding also comes under that. So there's pros and cons for this measure as well. Advantages is that it does take into account both economic and non-economic factors. But again, there's limitations because measuring the quality of life might seem better, but it's difficult to measure, which means it's difficult to compare against other countries. Which leads us to our third measure of economic growth, which we call the Human Development Index, or HDI. So we've got our GDP, our net social welfare, and then Human Development Index measures health, so life expectancy, education, which is the number of years we spend in school, and income levels. And then this is useful to measure against other countries, so we use these for comparison. It is helpful to see different income levels and different qualities of life, but the limitations is that short term, it's hard to measure these things short term, because over a lifetime we don't know when we're going to pass away, for example, and the data collection changes all the time as well. So just to summarize this little part of our topic, we've previously looked at economic growth is caused by real income, net social welfare, and productive capacity. But economic growth is measured by GDP, net social welfare, and human development index. So that's just the second part of our whole topic. The next part we'll be looking at is the effects or the impacts of economic growth on different sectors. So now in your workbook, you'll be able to relate this work to pages 88 to 93. So complete the notes and the questions on that section. And if you've got any questions, just email. Thank you.